welcome to our fifth stones regarding the 6 sacred stones of regenerative farming. In this series, we're going to be talking about polyculture. It's a form of agriculture in which more than one species is growing at the same time. My name is James Skeet. I'm with the Navajo Nation, Jadlashchid and Kiani Bashishchin. This is my wife, Joyce. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Joyce. Been married over 30 years. Come from back east, Pennsylvania. So I've been out here, ever since about late 1980s.
Thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking a little bit about the diversity angle, the maximizing the polyculture. It's kind of to imitate the way natural ecosystems are. The polyculture is the opposite spectrum of monoculture, in which only a member of one plant or animal species are cultivated together. And if we look at benefits of polyculture, it increases biodiversity. It enhances the soil health, which we're going to talk a little bit more about. And furthermore, I think on a larger scale, it eliminates fossil fuels, fertilizers, pesticides, and it really does promote clean water runoff. So let me start out with talking a little bit about our organization, Covenant Pathways. We have a demonstration farm in Vanderwagen, New Mexico. Our organization started 2015 when we were introduced to life in the soil. Since that time, we have established our own homegrown approach to growing we call Indigenous Regenerative Intelligence, which we have been talking about throughout this series. The Indigenous intelligence throughout my whole life has been to look through us Indigenous lenses that see all things as having sacredness. When I say Indigenous, it really is looking at the sacredness attributes, the quality and the diversity of all things. Plants are reaching out, my mom used to say, to heal us because, microbes have created this medicinal ingredients, which we are learning more and more, which I think science will move in that direction. We have to fine-tune ourselves to understand and use plants in an appropriate way. And for Indigenous people, it's really a lifelong study. They call it the medicine man or the medicine way. The Navajos have really learned this very unusual technique. They would put plants in their mouth and see if there's a reaction. But they were well known for medicinal plants and healing. A lot of tribes even went to the Navajo people to get healing. And the reason why they knew a lot about the plants and the healing was their relationship with the sheep. Sheep will not go to the same plant every day. It will go to different ones depending on what their microbiome in their gut is requesting. So in looking at that relationship of the ecosystem, the Indigenous people, the Navajos, being nomadic, they went to certain plants and certain things that all across the Southwest. I don't like to use the word food desert or desert places because I think it gives it the quality that this place is desolate and desertified. But if you look at a lot of desert plants and areas of arid regions, they hold some of the most medicinal, the most poignant and most salient types of medicinal plants that are found on the face of the earth. So in that connection, in that symbiotic relationship, in that understanding and listening to plants, listening to the soil, listening to the land, listening to things that are natural patterns, tying into those patterns, Navajos have learned to use the medicinal plants in such a way that they were masters. Food is medicine to Indigenous people, and that connection must always be secure and access. It is through these ancient rhythms that we try to mimic and honor Mother Nature, the dynamics, the flow of energy. And we're seeing that in our soil too. This flow of energy is dynamic. It's not just an instantaneous shot. It's a continuation of movement. The microbes live and die, and they excrete medicinal aspects of how they live and what they ate to the roots, which Joyce is going to talk a little bit more about. It is to these ancient rhythms, like I said, that we must try to honor, and we try to flow with that energy from the roots itself. And how to glean from nature was a delicate type of listening and art that it takes one's entire life. So on our farm, Spirit Farm, our mission is to grow growers and demonstrate possibilities to break down the colonization of a continuous sort of mono perspective. It's supposed to be called the American dream, but it's really about a dream that has multifaceted. So our vision is to emulate nature's patterns and flow with ancient rhythms. We are a demonstration farm that uses only natural practices, including heavily microbiological perspective, that systemic biological view to heal the high desert Southwest, to be a living example of how we can recover and reclaim traditional farming practices and spiritual practices alongside each other. Because I think the two in itself are very much enmeshed. They're not separated. They're not dichotomized. What you do physically is also what you do spiritually. What you do spiritually, you also do physically. The farm provides a visual model. We are opportunistic with growers. We try to create methods to increase quantity and quality of what they grow, as well as using less water. And that's part of the mycorrhizae, the fungal that we really heavily try to amend within our soil, within our compost, which is a critical step when growing food in our climate. It's very, very dry here. We get about 10 inches of rain. But I know there are other places, Australia, that use less annual rainwater. They use a lot less per year, but are still doing a lot of growing. I forget what they call it. I think it has to do with cover cropping and dryland farming. We want to reattach and reconnect with the soil, but we must first honor the soil and the microbial diversity. So then you might say, why mess with diversity? Why not monocrop? When we monocrop, we do it for a short-term gain, and we focus most of our attention to yields. In order to increase yields, we end up amending soil with artificial and chemical-based engineering created by scientists in the 50s. Furthermore, we become extractive farmers, withdrawing and using conventional processes and practices to finish crops by spraying and drying crops for our convenience, not fitting into nature's time and pattern. So that's happening all over the world. And that's one of the problems that we're having with Roundup. It's being sprayed to dry the wheat almost at the same time so it can be harvested. Same with oats and other grains. Today, many farmers have moved into commoditizing their crops for feed and depend heavily, very heavy, on subsidized support from the government to feed the so-called world. That's part of the green revolution that really started for America to feed the whole world. Monocropping or monoculture has revealed itself in the culture by basically polarizing our society, moving away from diversity into a type of mono-nationalism, systematic racism, on down the line. It is the diversity in soil that makes the dirt rich and nutrient dense, products that grow for our human needs. What is in Mother Nature that diversity and the expression of equity and richness? I mean, there's so much diversity in the patterns of Mother Nature itself that we need to tie back into. And I think this whole industrial mechanical mindset has been one to monocrop and really depend on yields and subsidies from governments. So what we're looking in our diversity is how do we see the biodynamics within our soil and within the work that we're doing. Corporations and businesses are dealing with sort of a difficult and diverse challenges within this pandemic right now. So much of the siloed perspective is surfacing. That can only be resolved, I really feel, in the diverse perspective with folks that have encountered barriers in their life, like Indigenous people and people of color that have been pushed to the margins. People of color have always overcome obstacles put in front of them, much like nature and the diversity it must have in order to heal us, to heal the land, and to heal the environment. Why are we so afraid of differences? Why not embrace diversity? It can only begin, I feel, from our treatment of the soil through humility. And that's one of the reasons why we really feel that this conversation about polyculture and poly perspective on things, the diversity on things, is so important.
When I first met James, I would often hear him say, God likes to watch color TV, not black and white. I've thought about that so often over the years, and now again today I'm reminded of that statement as we focus on diversity. Diversity comes in many shapes, forms, sizes, and colors that represent a gazillion of life organisms found here on Earth, both above and below the ground. A piece of the Creator's Spirit is established in all entities on Earth. Coming from a white culture and religion that was grounded in domination made it difficult for me to put aside my arrogance of thinking I had the right and best approach to answers and how life existed on Earth. My teachings had taught me that I was to dominate and control all life on Earth. Over my years of being married to James, I realized quickly to listen to his wisdom. And when he talked about communicating with the plants, it was a very difficult pill for me to swallow. But I knew in my heart that he was right. But how to do it was the challenge for me. So like always, when challenges are before me, I begin to pray. And then 2 years ago, we had a huge field of wild amaranth that grew naturally close by our farm. For many farmers, it is known as pigweed and as a nuisance weed. For the Navajos, when it is a young plant, they pick it and cook it, and they refer to it as a wild spinach. This amaranth was now full grown and full of seeds. Knowing the many uses for the seeds, I made plans to harvest some of the seeds. I walked down to the field, and rather than just start pulling off the seed heads immediately, I stopped and stood there for a while, thanking them and asking their permission to harvest some of the seeds. I became so overwhelmed with emotion and started weeping as I began to feel them reach out to me, as if they were saying thanks for asking us, and invited me into their field. The Creator loves diversity and color TV. For me, it was realizing that human beings were not created to be dominant and control things on Earth, but to be a part. All things were created for different roles, not to have domination or to have a more important role. Diversity is life. When we realize and honor the incredible numbers of the diversity of microbes, plants, animals, and humankind, then how can life be boring and dull? It takes all of diversity on life working together to create a healthy world. Diversity creates the health of all human existence, of all life on Earth.
Polyculture farming is an agricultural method of planting multiple crops in the same field. The most popular method of this type of farming is done by growing a mixture of perennial plants, which in turn can be used as a source of food for animals and humans. The one thing that we have to remember in polyculture is that what we're doing is we're really working with the pattern within nature, within the roots, within the exudates, and how the microbes are drawn to these roots. The roots and the exudates, they provide the sugars and candies for the microbes to be drawn into it. So it's actually the plant that suggests the microbes come to the roots. And so in that nutrient cycling, there's a relationship, a symbiotic understanding that's there. As you go up into a little bit higher surface, Indigenous people have often used corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters. The three sisters has to do with a symbiotic relationship. Now, the opposite of symbiosis is parasitic relationship. So in monocropping, what it does is it draws a lot of bugs. So it makes the plants vulnerable because they're taking so much of certain nutrients out of the soil. So the microbiome doesn't fully cover the leaves. So when you touch an apple, you're actually touching the microbes, not the apple itself. So in that context, what happens is it creates these holes, access holes for pests to come in. And a lot of insects and bugs know when plants are weak or needing certain nutrients and aren't provided by the soil. So in that less provision for the plants, what happens is pests will attack that plant. But if you look at the relationship that Indigenous people did, is they had the cover crop, which is the squash, cools the temperature on top of the soil, along with the wind barrier. The corn is used as a wind barrier. And the beans providing the nitrogen fixer for the corn, because the corn takes a lot of nitrogen out of the soil. So in that symbiotic relationship is really a pattern of nature. And how do we tie into the patterns? In order for us to tie into the patterns, we have to learn how to listen to the plants. And for Indigenous people, that was really their lenses, the Indigenous epistemological lens that they use in order to understand how nature works and how that derived into ceremonies, into dances, into songs, and that relationship. All it was saying was we are celebrating the relationship of what nature's doing and what it's mimicking. We're mimicking Mother Nature in the dynamics of that relationship, that it's a continuous flow of energy.
Whenever we talk about regenerative agriculture, you will hear us talk about mimicking nature. And when we look at nature, the soils have a diversity of microbes, and the plants growing naturally consist of many different species. In our soils, when we have a diversity of microbes, then we have healthier soils, healthier plants, less pests, and richer nutrients in the foods. And just like James said earlier, about when the sheep or animals are grazing, they're going to the plants that they need to keep that biome in their gut healthy. The plants also are requesting in the soil to the microbes what they need from the microbes. If they need magnesium, potassium, nitrate, if they need a pizza, a burger, whatever they need to eat, they are requesting that to the microbes. It is our goal to have a diversity of microbes. Then we need to have a diversity of plants growing.
So listening and looking through a different type of lens, more of a systems perspective, is very, very important to farmers, because as they learn how to do it and as they learn to exercise, they're concentrating their energy, they're managing the energy for that day and allowing nature to tie into that dynamics, and that dynamics forms itself into the maximum opportunity for microbes to not only live, breathe, reproduce, but to provide certain medicinal qualities to the roots of the plants, and then the plants uptaking it, capturing carbon and drawing it back down into the soil. All these are relationships that are depicted in the artwork of Native American people. They're depicted in dances. They're being expressed in certain attributes of within Indigenous cosmology. If you layer the atmosphere, the land, and then what's underneath, which is in the water. All those are perspectives of the cosmology, the order of things. I was at a conference with a bunch of permaculture, you might say hippies, and they were doing a lot of different things. They were making kombucha, they were looking at growing hemp and some other stuff. And I had to really just stop and let them know that, when we start growing hemp, we're falling back on the same issue of monocropping. And hemp takes a lot of stuff out of the soil. And this hippie group decided not to produce any other produce anymore. And they've moved towards hemp, a quick fix for them, and thinking that they're trying to be as natural and holistic as possible. And I had to stop them a couple times. They said, there's a really disorder. For Indigenous people, cosmology requires a lot of discipline. It requires that we take the time not only to listen, but to apply it. Our medicine people, when they become medicine men, they start at 5 years of age as an apprentice, and it lasts their whole lifetime. And here we are trying to do a lot of things from a very immediate, quick fix type of approach to Indigenous cosmology. And we have to really be careful, because a lot of this stuff is ancient history and we have to protect it. These are sacred lands. These are sacred areas. These are sacred space that we're entering into. And we have to really be careful that we don't just approach it from a tourist standpoint or a foreigner standpoint, or we have to really look at how we pilgrim to these places and to these spaces, and to honor the microbes in the process, to honor the land, to honor the plants, to honor the people that are on these lands.
Indigenous peoples always understood these concepts and always used nature to guide and direct them in everything they did. Today, so often in regenerative farming movement, little recognition is given to the first regenerative farmers, the Native Americans. They already had the concepts and developed and depended on mimicking nature to keep their environment healthy and in balance. So as a non-native, I want to fully acknowledge the Indigenous people and give them the credit for regenerative farming. It is not a new method or concept. It has been practiced decades ago, and they have the answers to heal our earth. As non-natives, we have to take the time to listen and learn from them, and most of all, honor them for the intelligence they bring to the table for regenerative farming practice.
You know, what's really interesting is that we have to look at what are some of the contemporary issues. You know, in this whole regenerative movement, some things that are happening, the increased sales is over 200% to 2,000% on direct marketing. Many farmers who are well down the path of regenerative practices now have little to no farm debt, are not participating in federal subsidies or crop insurance programs, and have taken no payment from the stopgap programs. They are not in need of lobbying efforts or policy influences. They're simply following the 6 principles, or 6, in our case, stones of soil health, and using adaptive stewardship management to achieve their success. The pandemic influences change, and it has changed. Things are changing. In a recent New York article detail how pandemics have altered American consumers' shop for food. The takeaway was fewer trips to bigger baskets and more lists planning, more online ordering, more produce buys, new store layouts, wider aisles, better sanitation, less crowding, better payment transition systems, fewer choices and more house brands, frozen category growth with healthier, clean labels, more local foods. And this is an interesting quote. It's a part of a greater awareness about healthy eating, food waste, climate change, as well as a desire to keep money in the neighborhood. So what does it mean? In short, it means it's an opportunity for regenerative farmers like us. It means that consumers are clearly showing the way, the better way, to not only get foods, but locally, healthier, clean foods. Those are all opportunities for us to really tap into as farmers and ranchers. On our farm, we've been able to sell a lot of our meats because our meats have fermented grains and they're very clean meats. And to have clean meats available to Indigenous people, that's where the healing is going to take place. The animals eating the omega-3s, moving away from the omega-6s, the inflammation, the cancers, the agitators, all those within our bodies. We're moving towards a different type of movement, I think, in regenerative farming. And to add the Indigenous perspective and the cosmology, we have a much more heftier understanding of where those roots go deep in our Indigenous worldview. And when those roots go deep, it's able to capture all the nutrients and is able to do a cycle, not only a drawdown, but a draw up in this nutrient cycling. We really appreciate you joining us today and sharing a little bit of our information about who we are as an organization and where we like to head. And we really are very happy to share any of the information. You can look on our website, covenantpathways.org, and you can reach out to us too. And we really appreciate you joining us in the diversity angle, the polyculture in this session. And we have one more stone to talk about. The next stone will be mimicking nature with animals, adjusting to patterns. This has to do with disturbance, mob grazing, some other things that we're doing here on the farm. And we thank you very much for joining us.